Good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science, Associate Director of Community Engagement, and I also teach in the Chicano Studies, Central American Studies, and African American Studies Department. So we're moving along today in our book series, and we have Tawny Paul, who has written The Poverty of Disaster, and this is her first book, and she is the director of the Public History Initiative and teaches at the UCLA History Department. Hi, Tawny. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. So let's get going. Can you please tell us the genesis of the book, how you came to research this specific topic?
Yeah, so I'm a social and economic historian. So I'm really interested in the everyday lives of ordinary people in history, and in telling history through their perspectives rather than through big events. And I'm really interested in how we can talk about the history of the economy in that way. So for me, the economy isn't a kind of abstract thing. It's the stuff of our everyday lives. So this book I came to a bit by accident, as many good research projects start. I was in the archives doing some work on something completely different. I was at an archive in Scotland, and I came across this book that was the commitment book for the Debtors prison in Edinburgh. And I was flipping through it and just noticed how many people were ending up in prison for their debts. And it occurred to me that it would be really interesting to think through the economy of the time from their perspective.
Wonderful. So in general, tell us what the book is about, along with its historical context.
Yeah, so this is a book that's about the insecurity, the financial insecurity that was faced by people in the middle classes during the 18th century. And it's told through the eyes of people who were sent to prison for failing to pay their debts. Now, the credit economy and the debt economy in the 18th century were a little different than they are today. So the first thing to say is that being in debt was a completely normal part of life. There wasn't very much cash in circulation in this period. So anytime you did anything economic, that took place using credit. And that credit wasn't extended by banks because there weren't banks at this time. It was extended between people and between shopkeepers and their customers. So everyone was in debt to everyone else. But sometimes people weren't able to pay their debts. And when they weren't able to pay their debts, one of the options that their creditors had were to send them to prison. And that's something that happened to an awful lot of people at the time. And I think it helps us to kind of rethink an economy that's often thought about in terms of success. The 18th century in Britain really is a time when we can see the roots of our modern capitalist economy. And we think about this period, this period of economic growth, of industrial revolution, in terms of the people who were successful, the big inventors, the merchants, the people who did really well. But actually a lot of people failed and did really poorly. And I think it's interesting to think about that history through their eyes.
Along those lines, what are some other main findings that you were able to discover in your research?
Yeah, so the kind of big finding that really sits at the core of the book is that 1 in 4 people of the middle class went to debtors' prison during their lives. That's an astounding number, 1 in 4. And so the book is really about the implications that had on people's lives. What was it like to live in fear of going to prison for debt? What was it like to know that someone or someone in your family would probably go to prison for debt? And what I find is that indebtedness and financial insecurity were really at the heart of what it meant to be a middle class person. We hear a lot today about financial insecurity, and we tend to think about it as a kind of new phenomenon. But if anything, the last 50 years since World War II are a kind of historical anomaly in terms of the security that many people have lived in. Being financially insecure was a very normal part of life, and it is part of our capitalist system.
Wonderful. And again, making these connections, you also talked about the role of fear in the book as it pertains to both incarceration for debtors, as you were saying, was very a normal part of life, and this financial insecurity. Can you talk a little bit more at length about that?
So, one of the things that I really emphasize is that financial insecurity is not just financial. It interrelates to a lot of other aspects in life. So, insecurity was emotional. It had a huge impact on how people felt, and that's where the fear kind of comes in. It had a huge impact on identity, on social identity, because part of what it meant to be middle class was to display the kind of trappings of being a middle class person. So what kind of clothing do you wear? What kind of household do you live in? And if your finances are incredibly insecure, then those kinds of things become insecure, and your very middle class identity, it feels like, could be ripped out from underneath you. And this insecurity was also physical. I mean, we can't forget that, this is about people ending up in prison, having their physical liberty taken away from them. So this kind of insecurity, I think, intersects with all aspects of cultural and social life. And one of the things about fear that I think is really important is how it motivates people to behave, or how it motivated people to behave at the time. Many of the people who were creditors who sent their debtors to prison did so out of fear for their own security. Because if you were someone who was tied into this credit economy, and you owed money to other people, collecting from the people who owed you money was really important to your own stability. So as soon as it looked like someone wasn't going to pay you, you might act in really punitive ways in order to coerce them into doing so.
Wonderful, Tawny. And this is clearly the contributions of your book, is being able to talk about these everyday economics where you're connecting the political, the physical, the social, and the cultural, and what that means for individuals, and that precariousness within middle class, and as it pertains to the larger society. Can you please share with us how your findings connect to current events?
Yeah, there are so many implications for today, to the kind of historical work that I've done in this book. First of all, we are living through a period of financial crisis. Some people live through financial crisis all of the time, but certainly since COVID, this is something that many of us are experiencing. And looking at how people dealt with crisis in the 18th century can help us to kind of understand the dynamics that we're seeing right now. So for example, on the theme of fear, there have been headlines in the news recently that fear might act as a kind of motivator for people in the economy, that if they are in fear of their financial security, they might work harder. I absolutely don't agree with that, because what my research shows is that people act in absolutely devastating ways when they are in fear of their own insecurity. Creditors chose to take away the liberty of their debtors when they feared for their own financial status. Another way that I think this relates to today is on the theme of incarceration, which is unfortunately a very hot topic in America. The historical example that I'm looking at is the earliest known example where we have incarceration rates kind of similar to the numbers that we see today in America. Now, obviously, the period that I'm talking about, there isn't a racial dynamic within that incarceration system, and that does make it extremely different. And for that reason, I would never use the term mass incarceration when I talk about the 18th century. But what is similar is the problem with pre-trial incarceration. A lot of people today end up incarcerated before they ever go to court because they can't pay bail. Similarly, in the 18th century, most debtors who ended up in prison were incarcerated before they were ever put before a judge. So there's this way in which incarceration and the justice system aren't really linking up.
These are very key connections that you're making. So again, the importance of history very much illustrating to us in today's terms things that we should know and learn about. And so I really urge folks to really pick up your book because it does not only teach us about history, but with the economic crises and the COVID crises of today. So our last question is, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us? Importantly, why anyone would benefit from picking up this book, and that certainly professors should assign it in their classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who's interested in the 18th century or in British history, I think it's kind of an obvious read. For readers who are interested in capitalism, I think this provides a really different and unique take. This is really a story of capitalism told through individual lives and experiences. One of my main goals when I wrote this book was to integrate the kind of quantitative research I was doing with individual stories. And so I think it has a very personal kind of perspective that a lot of people could connect with. For people who are interested in incarceration, normally when we talk about incarceration, we talk about it from the perspective of crime and histories of crime. Well, in fact, before 1800, most of the people who were incarcerated for debt. So this is a really important piece of that long history. Finally, this connects to so many kind of other themes within history and within contemporary society. People who are interested in migration, debtors' prison and the dynamics of financial insecurity prompted mass migration out of the British Isles. People who were put in prison sometimes found a way out by selling themselves into indentured servitude, and debt commodified bodies in ways that led to all sorts of kind of migration and further dynamics. So I think there are a lot of links for all of those different themes: migration, incarceration, capitalism, and insecurity, not to mention poverty.
Thank you so much, Tawny, for giving us time today and talking about your book.
Thank you for having me.
This is Celia Lacayo with UCLA LA Social Science, and don't forget to subscribe.